Welcome to this forum for candidates running in legislative districts 36B and 37A. I'm Lonnie McCauley of the Anoka County League of Women Voters, which is a sponsor of this forum. Co-sponsors are Coon Rapids Women of Today, Metro North Chamber of Commerce, North Suburban Optimist Club, and Transformative Circle. All candidates were invited to the forum. The League of Women Voters does not support or oppose any political party or candidate, but it does help citizens become informed voters and advocates for important issues. That's what this evening is all about, informing voters. Assisting in the forum tonight are Linda Rogers, Kathy Tinkelstead, Rita Newton, and Deanne Christensen. If you're interested in the League, Google LWVABC. Women and men and young people are invited to join. A quick note for those who have watched these candidate forums before. The COVID situation necessitated a couple of changes. There is no live audience. We are taping this forum with a skeleton crew. And we are taping early in this election season so that all voters can be informed about candidates before casting their votes. Our candidates here tonight for District 36B is Melissa HORTMAN and 37A is ERIN KOEGEL. They will answer several questions about and make closing statements. Answers are limited to 1 minute long, unless otherwise stated. Scott Simmons running for District 36B and Ken Wendling running for 37A are not with us tonight. Thank you, candidates, for speaking to voters about issues tonight and for running for public office representing the great city of Coon Rapids. I'd like to introduce now Linda Rogers, who is our moderator this evening.
Thanks, Lonnie. As Lonnie said, I'm Linda Rogers, and I too am a member of the Anoka Coon Rapids Area League of Women Voters. I live in a different legislative district, and I can't vote for either of the candidates in this race. We'll begin with an opening statement. ERIN KOEGEL will explain her background, why she's running for office, and goals for the state and legislative district. Ken Wendling could not be with us. ERIN KOEGEL.
Hi, I'm ERIN KOEGEL, and I grew up in the North Metro and have lived in Spring Lake Park ever since 2011 with my husband, Steve. And in December of 2018, we welcomed our first child, a little girl named Clara. And if anyone follows me on social media, I'm sure you've seen a billion pictures of her. So I graduated from UMD with a master's in advocacy and political leadership and began my career in public service at local nonprofits, helping people transition from poverty into self-sufficiency. And so like many women before me, I never saw myself running for public office, and I had to be asked multiple times. My husband and I made the decision together for me to run, and I cannot express how much of an honor it has been to have met so many members of our community. I love the stories you all share with me and how I might be able to help you make things a little bit better for our community. I hope I'm able to earn your vote again and represent our community in St. Paul.
And I'll follow up with a number of questions for ERIN KOEGEL, candidate for House of Representatives 37A. Research shows that regions that attain more economic growth are those with greater racial inclusion and smaller racial income gaps. What are your thoughts on how the communities in 37A can address barriers to racial equity?
I think this is a great question that should be asked of our Black and brown neighbors in our community. I don't have the lived experience to understand the barriers that exist in our community, and so we need to make sure that we have people at the table to help us decide these policies that affect them and not deciding policies for them. And so I think one of the biggest things is that we need to listen, we need to talk to people, and we need to believe them when they tell us what will help them get ahead.
Thank you. When history looks back at the current pandemic, what do you hope will be remembered about the legislature and the role it played?
Well, I really hope that we did our best to keep Minnesotans safe while mitigating the economic impacts, that we relied on science, on facts, and medical experts, and that the legislators themselves modeled good behavior during this pandemic to help keep one another safe.
As a legislator, what would you support in order for Minnesota to do its part to mitigate climate chaos?
So all Minnesotans deserve a clean energy future and a healthy climate. I serve on the Jobs and Economic Development. I hope to serve on the Jobs and Economic Development Committee again next session, and would like to see incentives for businesses that transition to clean energy, as well as investing in ensuring that we have the workforce to meet or exceed our state's clean energy and climate goals. You know, a bright future is possible with a just transition to clean renewable energy, supporting sustainable agriculture and providing good paying jobs that are healthy for the climate and our neighbors.
Please describe any experiences you have owning or managing a business, as well as specific advocacy efforts on behalf of the local small business community.
Well, my entire career I've worked in nonprofits and public service, but I've also had the opportunity to learn from friends and family members about what it takes to run a small business. My husband works for a small business that is a small construction company that's family run, and we need to make sure that that we have a fair playing field for small businesses can compete for clients and workers with the larger businesses, making sure that small businesses have benefits that can attract the best workers, and that we have the infrastructure they need to get goods and services to their clients. Working with members of the business community, we've worked on ways to address some of the traffic congestion on Highway 65 and Highway 10. Right now with a lot of that traffic congestion, some of the businesses up in the northern metro are unable to expand.
Thank you. Continuing on the topic of business, if elected, what would you do to provide a healthy business climate?
Well, I believe that all Minnesota communities are stronger when we're connected, so we need to make sure that we have safe roads and bridges, affordable housing, access to public transit, reliable utilities like internet access that connects us all, and we need to invest meaningfully in rural revitalization, public expansion, and border-to-border broadband. Serving on the Jobs Committee again, I was able to learn the workforce, what the businesses in Minnesota need as far as a workforce, and we need to continue to ensure that businesses in Minnesota have the best workforce in the nation and the world.
What do you see as the greatest need or challenge for youth in Minnesota? And how would you, as a state representative, help solve this issue?
Well, I think this is a really tough question, especially in today's climate. Our world has dramatically changed in the past few months. And one of the challenges that I've heard recently from some of the younger people is their barrier to unemployment. Many Minnesota students help support their families by working, but lost their jobs due to COVID. And currently students don't qualify for unemployment, which is leaving their families struggling to get food on the table and pay their rent and mortgage. So one thing we can do is extend the UI benefits to them. Other issues I've heard about are climate change, gun violence, the cost of post-secondary education. And so, again, we need to listen to young people and let them tell us how we can help them.
What is the appropriate role of the state legislature in assuring clean air and water now and for future generations?
Well, I think one of the biggest things we can do is listen to the science and the experts and helping Minnesotans understand best practices when it comes to ensuring clean air and water for our kids and grandkids. We need to turn those best practices into everyday practices. We all know to drain our boats and clean the trailers and stuff when we pull them out of the water to stop the spread of invasive species. And so just some of those best practices that we turn into everyday habits, I think, will make a big difference. Also, we can invest in electric buses. This past session, we got a chance to tour the New Flyer facility up in St. Cloud, and it's a place where they're building electric buses. These are good-paying jobs right here in Minnesota that can contribute to our cleaner air.
Which one issue do you think is the most important to work on with legislators across the aisle?
I don't think it's one issue. I think we should always try and work together with people that have different viewpoints. If we don't, we will never learn about others' perspectives. Sometimes it's tough, and you might never agree, but I don't think we should ever give up working together with people who have different perspectives. That's how we learn, that's how we evolve, and that's how we adapt. And so I think we should always try and work across the aisle with one another.
Drilling a little deeper into that question, what do you believe to be key elements of compromise?
I think one of the biggest elements is the relationships that you build with people, making sure that you get to know one another as people. Also, I think understanding motivations. When I first ran for office, I came at it as, we all understand the problem, we just have different approaches in getting there, but sometimes legislation is introduced to make a political statement. And so if you're understanding the motivation behind legislation, if it's a political statement or if it's actually an issue that people seriously want to address, you have a shot then to try and negotiate and compromise and fix the issue. And so I think the number one thing is figuring out the motivation, but then it's always about those relationships that you build with people, having those conversations about their family, about their community, about the things they care about, and so that you can build that mutual trust and admiration, and understand where people are coming from when they're pushing pieces of public policy.
You mentioned a little bit before about electric buses. What do you see as the future of electric cars in Minnesota?
Well, I'm hoping that we'll see more electric cars on the road. I'm hoping that we can incentivize Minnesotans to purchase electric vehicles through tax breaks. But one of the things the state needs to do is really get that electric vehicle infrastructure set up so that, I don't know if you've ever heard about range anxiety, but I guess people who have electric cars, always kind of wonder if they're going to be able to get to where they're going. So if we have that statewide infrastructure set up where, people don't have to worry about their range, I think that will make a huge difference in incentivizing people to buy electric vehicles. And then also, when we toured the New Flyer facility up in St. Cloud, it was just such an eye-opener to see how far the technology has come and how we can really make a huge difference when it comes to our air quality here in the cities just by putting electric buses on the road. So I'm excited about the future of electric vehicles.
Explain why you would or would not support restoring the right to vote to citizens living in the community on probation or parole due to a felony conviction. What current legislative or judicial barriers do you see?
Well, I support restoring the vote, and I think it's important to encourage everyone to participate in our democracy. I want to see people reconnect with their community after they have served their time, and I feel that they have a voice in the policies and direction of our state. I think some of the barriers are just legislatively getting it passed. I think we have a really broad coalition of people who understand this issue and want to see it move forward, and so I'm really hopeful that it won't be too long until we restore the vote.
More about law. What changes in campaign financing laws, if any, would you support?
So my dream scenario is to see publicly financed campaigns where every candidate has the same amount of money to spend. And I would also like to see all campaign spending be publicly disclosed and not hidden through independent expenditures or PACs. When I was out knocking on the door, now making phone calls, I always tell people to ignore anything that doesn't say prepared and paid for by the candidate themselves. And so, it's a lot of recycling that ends up in our recycling bins. And so I think that could make a huge difference in just kind of restoring the trust of our campaigns and the candidates too. So I hope that we can move towards at least public disclosure of all campaign spending.
What is your stand on copper mining in the Boundary Waters Canoe area?
So the BWCA is a treasure to our state, and although I don't think the BWCA likes me too well, because every time I've gone camping up there, there's been horrible storms. I was even up there during the 1999 blowdown. I want to see that area protected. So I want to see the BWCA and the watershed protected for future generations, and I worry about what effect the mining will have on the natural beauty of the area, and also the tourism industry that supports a lot of the North Shore and the Arrowhead. And so that's one I worry about, and I haven't been back to the Boundary Waters since '99, so maybe I'll have to make a trip.
And this question will wrap up before your closing statement. What initiatives do you support to improve crowded local highways, especially highways 65, 47, and 10?
Well, I live right on the corner of 85th and University Avenue, Highway 47, and so I see a lot of those accidents that happen. And one of my proudest things that I've done at the legislature wasn't even through a legislative process, but it was just about being really annoying to MnDOT and making sure that the safety of pedestrians crossing on University Avenue, that they looked at what the high rates of incidences were there. And so through some of my efforts, we got increased lighting, and new sidewalk paint on there too, so that people can see where the crosswalks are. I've participated a lot in the Highway 65 study. That was a bipartisan bill that we passed to make sure that we could get that and the study done, and now we just have to work on the funding to actually get that project completed. And then also work bipartisanly on the issues with the Ramsey Gateway Corridor and the third lane up to Highway 10 from Hanson up to Brown Lake Boulevard, and that's going to be a bonding project. And so when the last bonding bill came up, both of those projects were in it, and I've wholeheartedly supported that bill.
Thank you. And now we'll wrap up with your closing statement.
Well, thank you all for having me. I want to thank the League of Women Voters and members of our community. It's been a tremendous honor to get to know so many of my neighbors through the campaigning and work on your behalf at the legislature. One of my favorite parts about being a legislator and going out and campaigning is talking to you guys. I love when you reach out to me. I love hearing from you, and some of the best ideas I've gotten as far as legislation have come from you. You can reach me at my website, ERIN4MN.com. It's ERIN. FORMN.com. That's kind of my social media handle as well. And I hope that I can earn your support again and be your voice at the Capitol up in St. Paul. So I just really want to thank you all.
And one more thank you to you, ERIN KOEGEL, for sharing your views with the public. The League of Women Voters has supported informed voting for over 100 years. In the year 2020, we have many options to vote. Exercise your right to vote. House District 36B. And we have with us Melissa HORTMAN, one of the candidates. Scott Simmons could not be with us. We'll begin with an opening statement where Melissa can explain her background, why she's running for office, and goals for the state and legislative district. And then I'll follow up with a number of questions. Melissa HORTMAN.
Thank you. Well, thank you to the League of Women Voters for all the work that you do to make sure that people know about their right to vote and they know how to exercise it. And then when they do exercise it, that they have the information that they need to make a good decision. My name's Melissa HORTMAN, and I am currently the state representative for District 36B, that is a part of Coon Rapids and Brooklyn Park, and I am running for re-election here in 2020. My background is I grew up in Blaine, in the Blaine area, Spring Lake Park. I went to Blaine High School, and I graduated in 1988. And at that time, our school district was facing cuts. And I started to hear about other schools in the state that had a lot more resources. It didn't seem fair to me that our school funding was based on the property tax wealth of our community. And ever since I was a junior in high school, I have been fighting to get fair education funding for everywhere in the state.
Thank you. Research shows that regions that attain more economic growth are those with greater racial inclusion and smaller racial income gaps. What are your thoughts on how the communities in 36B can address barriers to racial equity?
Well, first, I think we have to admit that we have a problem here in the state of Minnesota. When we look around the country and people can say that in Minnesota we have some of the widest gaps in home ownership, employment, educational achievement, at a certain point in time we have to say to ourselves, Minnesota, we've got a problem, and we need to take action to address that. At the policy level, I think until very recently, actually until the killing of George Floyd, we haven't been really honest about saying that there's a problem with disparities in the state. Now, there's many different ways that we can go about making sure to address those inequities, but I think the most significant way is to focus on education and to make sure that when we start with our children coming in, we don't let those disparities develop over time, and we dedicate the resources, if it's extra resources for kids that need it to catch up or to be level with everyone else, that we dedicate those resources early on.
Thank you. When history looks back at the current pandemic, what do you hope will be remembered about the legislature and the role it played?
Well, one of the things that we did at the legislature this year, and I was very proud of this as the Speaker of the House, was that we were up and running really quickly. We were up and running faster than the United States House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., and I think we were second after Vermont in getting our committees fully functional on Zoom. I think what we learned is that we can use technology to do a lot more things than some of us knew about before the pandemic. Now, that can take something away from the interaction, because being in person with people, that there's a quality of the interaction that's desirable. But when we go to technological means, there's some people who can participate who have a really hard time participating when we do everything in person. For example, when we have legislative hearings and there's people with mobility impairments, it's a lot easier to make it to a Zoom than to a committee hearing at somewhere in the vast Capitol complex. Also, people who live in other parts of the state. The big problem in some locations is not having good internet access, but if you live far away, it's easier to participate by Zoom than to drive in.
Thank you. As a legislator, what would you support in order for Minnesota to do its part to mitigate climate chaos?
Well, there's a few significant areas where we can make a big difference. The electricity sector was the first area that we really went after to try to make a change. And we have done a good job of shifting away to renewable, clean energy sources in the electricity sector. So since we have done that, we need to electrify everything that we can. We know there's a lot more upside potential for wind and for solar, so there's even more opportunity for clean, carbon-free electricity. The next frontier is really transportation. We know that transportation is now the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. And I never thought I would be a person who would be able to afford or would have a fully electric car, but I drove my Tesla here, and I have to tell you that I think that this is the wave of the future, and we will all switch over very quickly when the cost of manufacturing these vehicles drops just a little bit. My husband and I charge our cars overnight when there's excess electricity on the grid. We buy it for a cheaper rate than our regular electricity, and our cars are completely silent with no smell.
Please describe any experiences you have owning or managing a business, as well as specific advocacy efforts on behalf of the local small business community.
Well, I grew up as the daughter of an auto parts recycler. So we had a sign at the family business, John's Auto Parts in Blaine, that said, "This is not a junkyard. This is an automotive recycling and dismantling center." And that's what we did. We took apart cars and we sold the parts. Now, of course, when I was a kid, I worked for free. That was just how it worked growing up in my family. Hard work was expected. It was part of what we did. And it was actually really fun on Christmas breaks to go in and work, whether it was putting together shelving or cleaning the store. Because we would all, as a family, after we were done working, we would have pizza and we would sit around and work. And in a way, there's nothing more satisfying than doing work with other people and then enjoying some fellowship when you've got the work done. So then for 10 years in the middle of my career, I worked as general counsel for John's Auto Parts. And I'm really familiar with how difficult it is for a small business to make money. It takes a lot of sales to pay all of your expenses, to pay your payroll, and to pay for all the things you need to run your business.
Following up on that business question, if elected, what would you do to provide a healthy business climate?
Well, the real challenge in the COVID-19 environment is to make sure that those who are disproportionately affected get the kind of aid that can help them survive. I think all of us are very, very worried about our restaurants and the personal care industries like salons and people who give haircuts. You know, some people are doing much better in the COVID-19 environment. I understand that alcohol sales are way up and people are eating a lot of pizza. I would say 90% of my diet during the COVID pandemic is Lucky Charms or pizza. But for those businesses that have been hit harder, the question is, how do we structure aid so that they can make it, right? The government doesn't have enough money to cover everybody's losses for the things that they're experiencing, whatever an economic downturn is. But there are some things that we should be able to do for those who can hang on and make it through the worst of the pandemic. And that's the way we're trying to structure grants and loans, is to get people to hang on.
What do you see as the greatest need or challenge for youth in Minnesota? And how would you, as a state representative, help solve this issue?
Well, I think one of the big problems is growing up today, you grow up with a device. Your cell phone is kind of your best friend and your addiction. And I think it's possible for kids to self-isolate. It's possible for them to spend way too much time alone in their room, playing games or consuming social media. And I think it takes more effort than it used to interact with other people. But I think we're finding that people are really lonely when they spend too much time with technology. So on the good side, the kids today are going to be way better at using technology than the generations before them. But on the negative side, it takes more of an effort to engage and to be part of community with other people.
What is the appropriate role of the state legislature in assuring clean air and water now and for future generations?
Well, we need to have really clear standards that businesses and farmers need to meet with regard to emissions into the environment. So whether the emission is into the water, into the air, or onto the land, there have to be standards, things you can and cannot do, and then the government has to enforce those things. There's also a role for incentives, but we do need to have rules. We need to have standards that people live up to. I think sometimes those in the Republican Party do focus more on incentives. And I think that we know there's certain goals we won't be able to reach if we just have incentives. For example, the emissions into the Mississippi River that are causing the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. At a certain point, we need very enforceable standards that we make sure the pollution is not getting off of the land and into the river.
What one issue do you think is most important to work on with legislators across the aisle?
Every issue is important to work on with legislators across the aisle. I have to say, one of the things that surprised me, I was lucky enough to become the Speaker of the House after the 2018 election. The Democrats have the majority in the Minnesota House of Representatives. I didn't think that my relationship with the Republican leader of the Minnesota Senate would be a high point of my 2 years of service. But as soon as I became the Speaker, I ferociously pursued Senator Gazelka that we go out and have dinner. And I am so glad I did. We brought our spouses, we brought our chiefs of staff and their spouses, and we talked to each other as human beings about why did we run for office and what did we want to do and how did we want to treat each other. And we have stuck to the things that we said at that dinner nearly 2 years ago. And one of the things we said is there's a time for the campaign season where we articulate our differences, and then there's a time for the governing season where we look for those places where we can agree.
More about working together. What do you believe to be key elements of compromise?
Well, everyone has to be willing to give and take. You know, a person in political life is just like a person in a marriage. You can't have everything that you want the way that you want. And compromise is not the same thing as capitulation. We all have to be willing to meet someone else halfway, and a reasonable halfway, right? Not taking an unreasonable position to begin with to make the halfway closer to your side. And so one of the things that I think is important about compromise is respecting the other person's point of view. Right now, Representative Kurt Dowd and I are having a little problem getting an agreement on the bonding bill. But one thing that has helped a lot is for me to make sure that he knows I respect his point of view. He's concerned about the governor's use of executive authority. He's concerned about the deficit. It is entirely appropriate for him to be concerned about those things, and I can listen to him and work on those issues and care about the things he cares about, as he will work with me on the things I care about, like passing the bonding bill.
You've touched on this a bit before, but what do you see as the future of electric cars in Minnesota?
Well, I really think it is the wave of the future. I have to say it's a ridiculous amount of fun. How we got to the point where I am driving an electric car is when my minivan died, it literally stopped going forward. And my husband and I were car shopping, and I was driving his electric car. And we were at a stoplight, and he said, "Give it everything it's got." And I was like, "I have been giving it everything it's got. I know how fast it goes." And he's like, No, really, really kick it. And I did. And the thing about an electric car, it's really zippy. It's really fun to drive. And I think when people thought about electrifying the transportation sector, they thought they would lose something about the performance of a gasoline engine. It actually is a much higher quality experience for the driver. And so I think that the switch over will happen actually pretty quickly once the cars are a little bit cheaper to buy. When you take out the expense of gasoline, that neither one of us are putting gas in our car, that really adds up over time.
Explain why you would or would not support restoring the right to vote to citizens living in the community on probation or parole due to a felony conviction. What current legislative or judicial barriers do you see?
Well, we've all been hearing a lot about the phrase systemic racism since the killing of George Floyd and all of the protests afterward. And when we think about systemic racism, this is actually one of those issues where we can see it most clearly. The reason why felons are not entitled to vote is this is something out of the slave-catching era. This was a way to deprive individuals who were given the right to vote by President Lincoln of their ability to exercise that vote. And when you say to yourself, in 2020, there's still Jim Crow laws on the books, and we should be doing something to get rid of them, this is one of them. So that's the moral reason. The practical reason is our current system is very confusing. There has never been a year where I've been running for office, I haven't gone to somebody's house and say, "Can I count on your vote in November?" And one or more people say, "I'm not sure if I'm legally entitled to vote. I served my sentence, I've been out of prison, and I'm not sure if I have my civil right back." You shouldn't be able to accidentally commit the felony of voting when you're not entitled to vote. It should be clear-cut. If you're in prison, you cannot vote. If you are out, you can, depending upon the sentence that you have, as long as the sentence when you're in prison is long enough. So we need it for the moral reason, and we need it for the practical reason.
What changes in campaign financing laws, if any, would you support?
Well, I think we need to have total disclosure of who's paying for what. I think it's a little bit unfortunate that the First Amendment has been interpreted to mean anybody can spend whatever they want, even if they're a corporation, because that means some people have a lot more right to influence our election than other people. But at the very least, until that is overturned by either Supreme Court decision or constitutional amendment, we should have very strong disclosure laws so that if I get something in my mailbox that says Minnesotans for good jobs, and it sounds really good, but it's from an interest that will make a lot of money if the position that they're advocating is adopted, I should know that as a voter. I should know who it is who's trying to influence my vote.
What is your stand on copper mining in the Boundary Waters Canoe area?
We have strong environmental laws in Minnesota, going back to the 1970s. We have laws that are very strong to protect our air, our water, and our land. And under existing law, nothing should be permitted that would damage our water, our air, or our land. I think that given that the law is protective of the environment, we need the judicial system to be making the determination of whether a project will pollute or not. The last thing in the world we need is a bunch of politicians trying to make a decision that's based on evidence. The court cases will rely on hydrologists, geologists, and lots of data. At the legislature, you can say anything you want. It doesn't actually have to be true. As somebody with a background as a lawyer, when you're in court and you say something, it must actually be true. You must have evidence to back it up. And so I think we want really important decisions, like whether a mine will pollute or not, to be made by people who have to listen to the evidence.
Thank you. We've talked about vehicles tonight. Now let's talk about the surface that they travel on. This is our last question. What initiatives do you support to improve crowded local highways, specifically Highways 65, 47, and 10?
We need more lanes. I'm a North Metro girl, and my whole life I have seen undue investment in the South Metro. And part of it is because people already live there, but the reason people already live there is prior investment in the transportation infrastructure. It is our turn. It has been our turn for a long time, and there are significant safety issues in all of those corridors that you talked about, Highway 65, Highway 47, Highway 10. It is well past time for there to be 3 lanes all the way up Highway 10. There are so many accidents because there's not enough road space. We need to have the investment up in North Metro roads to have the capacity we need to move safely.
Thank you, and now your closing statement.
Well, thank you for having me here tonight, and thank you for people who care enough about their vote to take the time to watch things like this and to undertake the effort to get out and vote. This year, with the pandemic, I think a lot of people should seriously consider voting absentee by mail ahead of time. In Minnesota, you can request an absentee ballot at mnvotes.org. It's the Secretary of State's website. It's easy to remember. It's basically minnesotavotes.org. And when you go there, you can put in your name and your address. You can check and see if you've already requested your ballot. And once you get it and you send it in, you can check and see if it's been received and if it will be counted. I think it's important for every single person to have their voice heard, not only in the election, but also during the legislative sessions. So I really appreciate when people take the time to send emails or to call. We really listen to the people in our districts, and often people who live in our districts and work in different areas know a lot more about issues than I do. So thank you for voting, and thank you for your input at the state capitol.
And a big thank you to you, Melissa Hortman, for sharing your views with the public. Thank you to CTN for taping and showing this forum, and thanks to our co-sponsors, Transformative Circle, Coon Rapids Women of Today, Metro North Chamber of Commerce, and the North Suburban Optimist Club. The League of Women Voters has supported informed voting for over 100 years. In the year 2020, we have many options to vote. Exercise your right to vote.